My name is Maria Elena Durazo, and I was elected 1 year ago in 2018 to the California State Senate, representing District 24 in Los Angeles. In the early 90s, I had just gotten elected as president of the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union, Local 11. And it was a very, when I was elected, it was around some very contentious issues. So we were in the process of rebuilding a union, a local union that really needed to be restructured and reactivated with new leaders and negotiating new contracts with employers in this industry. This was our new mission from what had existed prior to my election. Well, what changed the labor movement was that there were a few unions in Los Angeles, starting with the change in my union, a change in our leadership in 1988. We started to change the labor movement around the issue of low-income workers and immigrant workers. That in order for the labor movement in this generation to be strengthened, in order for the labor movement to get stronger and grow and represent so many hundreds of thousands of workers in Los Angeles that were working at very, very low wages, we had to invite the immigrant workers, invite low-income workers to join the labor movement, and we had to connect as a labor movement with the broader community. We had to see the low-income workers, immigrant workers, as part and parcel of an entire community, not just their workplace, but rather what was their life like? What was it like to raise a family on what they were earning? How were they being treated in their workplaces? What was the level of exploitation that was taking place? We had to make that all part of a single movement, not, well, here's a group of workers in this particular workplace. What do they need? And let's sort of, try to change that with the employer, do battle with the employer to change it. It had to be a whole different way of looking at our community. So what we tried to do with a few unions, starting with us and the hotel and restaurant workers, a few years later, the janitors with our beloved late president of that union, Mike Garcia, the Justice for Janitors movement, that strike. We also started a home care workers campaign for those workers. There was drywall workers in the construction industry that were immigrant. So we really tried to make a much bigger movement than a single workplace by workplace. We would never be able to bring justice to those workers if it was a single small workplace by workplace. Well, 1986 was fairly early in the transformation of the labor movement via low-income workers and immigrant workers. So in 1986, I believe we were about the only union that had really a committed leadership to inviting immigrants into the labor movement, inviting their families to be part of the labor movement. We took full advantage of reaching out to immigrant workers with services in order to help them take advantage of the 1986 IRCA. And so it was really important to develop this trust, to show that we were willing to help them change their lives, even if they weren't a member of a union. But in our union, we received a significant grant from our national union to do this service. We hired attorneys, we hired paralegals, we went to workplaces after workplace amongst our own membership, and we provided this service so that they could see we cared about the whole family, not only, again, their workplace, the shift at their workplace. Although this was a big opportunity, some of the unions took advantage of it. Many didn't really understand what kind of connection and opportunity it was. There was an organization, for example, started that connected labor and the community to try to provide these services. So it was really an extraordinary opportunity, which if you thought just a few years ahead, the law provided that you could become a citizen within 5 years with this amnesty that we had just won. I had been involved with immigration issues for 10, 15 years before that. And so it was a significant victory for our community overall. And so we tried to take advantage of this, again, to make that connection. If you looked ahead, within only 5 years of applying for the amnesty, you could actually become a citizen of this country. So not only was it helping to stabilize undocumented immigrants, it was also creating a stronger foundation for political involvement and political leverage and political strength just 5 years away. 5 years, that's all. And then we would begin to see the growth in the number of legal residents, the growth in the number of citizens, the growth in the number of voters from these communities. So this was 1994, and in my union, my particular union of hotel and restaurant workers, we had already begun this transformation within our union, a very significant change that got the attention of other unions and the labor movement to see that we could make a change in the union that also had a much, much bigger impact. So I was in my union. I was president of my union, of the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union, and we were engaged already for a few years in some battles with employers. And this was a very significant cultural change in the industry. They had gotten used to, unfortunately, because of prior union leadership, the employers had gotten used to paying whatever minimal increases in wages. They treated the workers badly, but it still wasn't as bad as being non-union. They still had a union contract that they could use. But we wanted more. For too many years, the employers had taken advantage, full advantage of this situation in the union. So we were engaged in some real battles. And I had met, for example, Reverend James Lawson, who was a nationally, internationally known strategist on nonviolent direct action philosophy. We had connected with other organizers of other unions. We really were in growing the beginnings. We were in the beginnings of a movement. And it was both extremely difficult because we had not done that before, but at the same time it was very exciting. And those immigrant workers finally, saw that this was a chance for them to make a change in their lives, to make a change in their families' lives. So this was, again, because this was the beginnings of a movement in our union, when Prop 187 happened, we were ready for the fight. We were ready to fight back, and we were ready to do it in an organized way, in a way that wasn't just anger and out on the streets, but in a way that was going to have a much bigger permanent impact in our community. Not just be angry about Prop 187 and overturning Prop 187, but rather what was a bigger vision that we could incorporate into these battles. And Prop 187 was one of those battles. It was extremely offensive. We were outraged I was outraged. Our workers were outraged that they would be treated that way with this Prop 187, basically being told, you're nothing, you're worthless, you don't deserve public education, you don't deserve services, and everybody around you should be, looking out for you and reporting you. That kind of, I'm sure there was a mix of fear as well, but more than anything, it was, how dare you? We work hard in this country. We came to work hard. We sacrificing with our families to help these industries and this economy, and you're going to tell us that we are not worthy of public education for our children? It was outrageous. Well, at best, there were some electeds, including Democrats. There were some who saw the injustice of Prop 187 and saw that it was wrong. They were slow to respond, to come around, but there was a handful who eventually came around. So what it communicated was a hesitancy towards our community, a hesitancy to take risk and to stand strong with hardworking men and women and families who were under attack. So that hesitancy really upset us. It was really upsetting. But we're grown-ups. We know we have to deal with the reality of that time. So while we pushed the electeds, we also knew that ultimately either they weren't going to become stronger representatives of our community, or we were going to have to unelect them and elect a new generation of elected officials. We knew we had to create a bottom-up movement to show that not only could we march in the streets and picket in the streets, but that we also were training real troops, a real army of men and women who were going to go knock on those doors, who were going to go on the phones, who were going to be spokespersons for either a candidate, a good candidate, or for an issue like Prop 187. So we had to show them, to give them a backbone, we had to build a bottom-up, stronger movement. So we had to invest both in the moment as well as longer term. Now, this was not very well understood, but just seriously, this was not understood by most elected officials. They were so used to, although we had won many victories since Roybal was elected to the city council, there were victories in our past up until this moment. But to have a significant change in the political landscape was going to take more than what we had seen in the past, more on our side. And that was the only way that we were going to change the attitude of electeds of being so weak when it came to our issues and the immigration issue. There was enormous racism that was being expressed through Prop 187. And so you can imagine, just like we're facing today with President Trump, that Pete Wilson and Prop 187 had the effect of stirring up that racism. There were all these electeds. The Republicans reacted the worst because they joined. The Democrats, a couple of them were really good and strong, but mostly it was a weak reaction. But our response had to be, we knew that after the November election, whatever happened with Prop 187, here was an opportunity to grow something much bigger and stronger and more permanent. I could say very comfortably that through our outreach with our own members, housekeepers and cooks and dishwashers, I could say that through outreach to them, hopefully, there was also the influence over their sons and daughters. So it wasn't a direct outreach to the students in the schools as much as it was an outreach to them through their parents, because we know that they cared about their parents. And when they saw their parents being actively involved, I believe that had a big influence. I think what labor brought was a really critical role of, one, resources. The labor movement had resources. Now, my union in particular, we weren't a wealthy union. However, our union was an institution that was consistently contributing resources to this organizing of our community. We were investing resources, the kind of money it takes to do organizing, to have full-time organizers to do this kind of work. We had the resources to organize marches. We had the resources, the kind of resources that many nonprofit, small organizations don't have. We were able to pull that together and do it in such a way that it really allowed for a consistency, and it allowed for a strength that you could rely on, very, very much the role of labor. That was part of the role of labor, providing the resources to be able to move in the right direction. We also provided resources of training leaders. So recruiting leaders in our hotels and restaurants, the other unions within their members, and training them about how to be leaders, training them how to be organizers, how to talk to their coworkers. When people are afraid, what do you say? And it's a similar skill when they went to go knock on the doors of for a particular candidate that we really wanted to elect, or against or for a particular issue that was on the ballot measure. So what do you do when you knock on those doors? You show your strength, you show your passion. That kind of training led to hundreds, if not thousands, of men and women able to contribute to this movement that had not existed before. They had never been tapped. And so what we contributed was maybe something that had been used in a small way in the past. Usually there were checks that, unions wrote out to a candidate running for office, or they might get a handful of volunteers here and there. But that was so different from investing in our own movement, not just sending a check to a candidate for office. Well, there were electeds like Pete Wilson, candidates like Pete Wilson, who just didn't have their ear on the ground. They didn't know what was going on as far as immigrants organizing, the changes in the labor movement. And frankly, they felt like if they could win by stirring up racism and discrimination, they felt they were going to win. And they turned out to be right in the sense of they won the immediate elections. And they won many times through the various cycles that came after that. But they didn't understand what was going on the ground. They didn't understand that there were union leaders who were committed, who had strong relationships with community leaders. And there weren't that many of us, both in the labor movement and in the community, but there were enough that we had these strong relationships. So Pete Wilson didn't understand that. He didn't know that what was going to come as a result of Prop 187 was a much stronger California and a much more pro-immigrant California. He just wanted to win that election. And I don't think he was concerned about how far down the road this was going to help him or help Republicans. But I think because they didn't have their ear to the ground, they were so confident that the racism that they were stirring up was going to last for a really long time or forever. Well, I remember vividly the beginning of the march, um, where people had started to gather. I had never been in a march that big before in my whole life. I had never been in a gathering that big in my whole life. I had been to the Chicano Moratorium in Fresno, California, and that was probably 1,000 people, but this was already, I could see the growth in the number of people gathering. And it was, quite inspiring. And I could see that it was families that were gathering. It wasn't limited to sort of a stereotype of an activist, with their fist raised up in the air. It really was working class families, of various generations, from parents pushing their kids in strollers to older, the older generation and everywhere in between. It was really just you could tell it was a really special moment for our community to be able to express our outrage at Prop 187. And that made me feel like this was something that wasn't just going to go away. And it was up to us to figure out how to keep it going, how to make sure that it just didn't fizzle away. So I was both excited, I was so happy, and at the same time, sort of beginning to think, how could this become something that continues on? I remember all the people speaking on the stage or anything, but I remember there was a stage. I remember we marched from the beginning down to downtown. I mean, it was big. It was just really big. That's what I remember the most. Well, the issue of carrying Mexican flags or not continued on for several years. It wasn't something that just came up for that one march and then went away. It became something that we continued to debate within organizations and in the movement. And there were those of us, frankly, personally, I didn't think there was anything wrong with showing pride of our history and our culture and our roots. I didn't think there was anything wrong. I'd been to, the Irish parade. I mean, it's a very natural thing, especially in this country, to show pride of your roots, your immigrant roots. But it was getting to the point where, because the media and electeds were attacking, that to me it wasn't worth the battle to distract us from what was the real issue. And so slowly I became an advocate for let's show others that yes, we care about our roots, but we're in the US. We're many of us are citizens or born here or naturalized, and we care about this country and we love this country. So for those that are attacking us, and because it's not a violation of a principle to carry an American flag, it really does relate to who we are, what we're about, what we have been for generations and generations. So I, transformed to, let's not use the Mexican flags. Let's take that off the table as an issue to be used against us, and let's focus on the real issue. The real issue is respecting the hard work of our communities, regardless of where they're born and what language they speak. Well, the political landscape changed enormously from 1994 to today. And it's changed because we took on a very different approach to what I think might have happened in other parts of the country whenever there are attacks on people of color or immigrants or women. We wanted to build something lasting. And part of that was to build organization of trained skilled organizers, meaning those men and women learning how to reach out to our communities. And it really made a difference. When we went out to work to elect Gil Cedillo to be assembly member, the community, the immigrant citizens, those immigrants who had become citizens, had never been talked to. Nobody had ever reached out to them. And so when they saw that people like themselves, immigrants like themselves, were knocking on their doors, asking them to please exercise your right to vote, go vote this day, they were pretty surprised that anybody cared. So it was a good introduction to the political system. And some of them were recent citizens because of the amnesty bill. Some had been citizens prior to that, but had never really been approached. You see, they were treated as this other group of the not likely voters. They were put in that category. And because they were poor, they didn't have money, so why would anybody reach out to them? When we started within the labor movement, started to reach out to them in a continuous way, and I use Gil Cedillo's election as an example of that, it brought out voters that nobody expected. They were not on the radar. They weren't supposed to vote. Nobody even knew that they existed. And so when we did that work of paying attention to them, inviting them to vote, in fact, saying to them it was their responsibility to vote, that was a whole different change in the political landscape. And I would say it was because of the labor movement we were able to build that and use that to transform Los Angeles political landscape. Maybe the fear of a demographic change is another way of saying we're stoking up racism in our communities. It's a age-old tactic that's used to pit us against each other. Changes in demographics when the Italians came, when the Irish came. Yes, that's a tactic that's used by those who are, it's used, this quote-unquote fear of demographic change is code word for use racism to pit people against each other. And I think it's done with the sole purpose of creating an economy that works for those who are wealthy and big companies, and it works against working people. Because when you have a native born, whether he's white or Mexican American, being afraid of an immigrant to take his job, again, that's just code word for I should have that and you shouldn't, but it's really meant to create an underclass of workers. It's meant to create an exploitable class of workers. It's meant to create different tiers of workers, so some could feel better than others, but in reality, we're all in the same boat. So I see this fear of the change in demographics. It has a very deliberate intention to it. And that intention is to create the kind of economy where we're all getting a whole lot less than what we deserve because there's fewer and fewer people who are making the profits. So I've seen this over and over and over again. When I started with the garment workers, it was the same thing. It wasn't because native-born citizens wanted to go work in a sweatshop. That wasn't it. But it was used as an excuse to keep them divided. And that was a very common thing that happened in the overall labor movement, is they were convinced that somehow they were going to be better off without all these immigrants here. But that's not true. And we changed the national labor movement through Los Angeles, through California, so that workers and industries all over the country could see that we had to defend immigrant workers. We had to fight for them. We had to have equality for them when it came to wages and enforcement of laws and labor laws and health and safety laws. That as long as there was that group that was so exploitable, everybody was going to be held down. And we were all going to be in a bigger mess. So we really, it's a tactic, it's a strategy that's very successfully used, unfortunately, to deprive us, to deprive all workers of what we deserve. So in Sacramento, no doubt that we're in a different place politically from the time of 1994. However, I had a bill, just to use as an example, to expand Medi-Cal, which is for very low-income people, to expand it from the 0 to 18 years of age undocumented to everybody, that we should make no distinctions. We are all Californians. They are men and women who come from families who work and contribute so much to this economy. And yet, I still hear arguments about, oh no, they're undocumented, they're illegals. We can't do that. And so we moved the needle forward a bit to now, there were more young adults covered, but why aren't our seniors covered? Why aren't others covered who are undocumented if they are really going to be treated as Californians equal to everybody else? So we've got a ways to go. We have a ways to go. We had other legislation that would apply if you had a credit, workers' credit, working person's credit, and for your taxes. But that didn't apply to undocumented. But they work hard. So we have a way to go. I'm proud of how far we've gotten. I think all Californians should be proud of how far we've gotten, but we have a ways to go. Well, I would say that some of the challenges that are still ahead for us is that there are those on the pro-Prop 187 who saw it as a model for the rest of the country. They won. They passed the ballot measure. They stirred up the racism. They elected Pete Wilson. So as far as they're concerned, they won that election. They continued, the Republican Party and those who thought like them about Prop 187, they continued to use that in the rest of the state. I mean, it's not something that just changed overnight. Our political landscape didn't change overnight. But they continued to use that in the state. They continued to elect for several cycles, but it gradually changed. They continued to elect people who are anti-immigrant. So they then went beyond California and took it to other states. And so years later, you have SB 1070 in Arizona. You have in Arizona also the legislation that was passed to stop ethnic studies, to not allow ethnic studies in public education. So there are a number of examples of how they continue to use this. In our own California, there was the affirmative action a ballot measure that was passed. So there were a number of ways in which they continue to use that racism and those attacks against communities of color and pit us against each other. And then, like I said, they used it in other states. And there's probably states still today where the anti-immigrant hysteria is used to try to elect. Now, the good side is that we learned that we could deal with that. We could beat back that racism. voters changed in California. Not only did immigrant citizens begin to vote in larger numbers, and those numbers grew, but the electorate changed in California. They began to understand, with all the ways in which we showed housekeepers just fighting for a living wage, or janitors just fighting for a living wage. We showed the electorate that we're much better off as a state. Our economy is better off when they're included and when they're paid good wages. So we changed the electorate in a number, that was part of it. And I think that California then, it took us all these years, but we're now at the point where being an immigrant is held up in a more respectful way in this state. I still think we have a lot more to do to show the respect, but nonetheless, it's a very different state from back then. So the lessons are, one, you don't run away from the racism. You call it what it is. And it was racism that was used to pass Prop 187. You don't run away from it. You face it, and you challenge voters. You talk to voters. You talk to voters one by one. You go into communities. If there's tension between African American and immigrants, what is that tension? Bring leaders together. We did something that grew years later. In the year 2003, we did the Immigrant Workers Freedom Ride, a national movement to take us out of the environment after the September 11th attacks. It became a very anti-immigrant environment in this country. To take us out of that, we did a national march and bus ride of 900 people from all over the country, landing in Washington, D.C. and then New York City. And that changed because we did real organizing on the ground in small communities, getting law enforcement to come out, clergy to come out. So these lessons of building coalition, the lesson of talking to not the usual suspects, to join the movement, to stand up for what are real human values, all of that grew out of what we did, started to do around Prop 187, grew it to another scale, grew it statewide, and I think we grew it nationally as well.